about presenting some random thoughts about birds in flight that had been inspired by this exhibition of paintings by Judy and Michael DiGiorgio. I have to admit, when I was first approached to do the exhibition, I thought I was in for a big challenge. I've followed Judy's work for decades, and I didn't know Michael's work. So I might also admit that I was wondering how I was going to integrate their work, since their careers have taken different paths and their approach to art making seemed to be very, very different. Judy's work has been contextualized within the global art scene, and for Michael, this exhibition represents a new context for his work, usually seen in concert with that of illustrators who capture the details of avian species for serious birders and aficionados. But once the two of them got together, the differences disappeared. Both are inveterate bird watchers, and sitting in their company as they go over what birds they sing, what the characteristics are, and I'm sitting there going, I barely know what a pigeon looks like. One is simply intimidated by the extent of their knowledge of birds, their habits, which would escape the more earthbound of us. DiGiorgio's love of birds dates back to his childhood, and his professional illustration career grew out of that passion. For Cotton, this involvement with birds is part of a larger series she has dubbed Nature Morte, literally dead nature, as opposed to the French translation for still life painting, which has occupied her over the last decade. So as Michael is dedicated to capturing birds in the prime of their lives, Cotton moves us with her focus on their life force as it leaves their bodies. So in thinking about ideas of their work, I did an immediately random search, thank God for the internet and Google, and reached back into my memory for images and ideas I thought that could be brought to the discussion of their work, and this process was fun and offered quite a few possibilities for me. So what I'm showing you here is a terracotta statuette of a woman with a bird face from the late Cypriot period, about 1450 to 1200 BC, and a more contemporary version of a birdman symbol from the Mississippi region in North America. So I decided to start at the beginning and found examples of human, bird, this bird goddess was an interesting character because she had a dualistic nature. And what you find is that, art historians who deal with prehistory don't often really know what they're about, but they sort of surmise from the context within which objects are found about what they mean. So, in the way that men always like to talk about women, this entity could also be a giver of life, or she could represent death, particularly if she was in the guise of a vulture or an owl or other birds of prey. But inevitably, notions of death encompass regeneration. We find the birdman symbols between 1000 and 1500 AD in Native American cultures, particularly in the Mississippi Delta. The birdman was believed to be a supernatural deity who resided in the upper world with the spirits of the sun, the moon, and the star, and therefore was a link between heaven and the earth, and was thought to move between the two realms as a messenger to the gods and then back to the humans. So it could encompass the character of various birds. Again, it's interesting to see what kinds of birds appear. And birds of prey get a lot of play in these kinds of systems because they're strong, they're aggressive, and also can inspire fear. So the birdmen could look like and incorporate elements of eagles, hawks, or falcons. And in relationship to the ideas presented by the female figures in Cyprus, it's notable that these are all strong, high-flying predators. In most of the ritual systems, the mask was an important vehicle by which the birdmen communicated with spirits and activated their spirits. And for the Mississippians, the birdman entity was a way to align themselves with the spirits of the upper world and gain favor for victory during the battles. And of course, probably one of the best known birds in art history is the Egyptian god Horus. He was one of the three most important deities, as you may know, in the Egyptian pantheon, along with Osiris, who's considered his father, and Hathor, who is variously identified as his sister or his wife. So, you know, it's like Chinatown. My sister. His specific realm is the sky and war and hunting, and his representations evoke a falcon or a hawk-like bird, and this makes sense. In this representation, he is a protector of the pharaoh Nechanebo II, who often put himself into a very close connection, even merging himself with Horus. And according to the website of the Metropolitan Museum, Nechanebo II was also the focus of a cult where he was referred to as Nechanebo the Falcon, which would indeed be represented by this striking conjunction of a powerful function, a falcon, and a monarch. Then this is one of my favorite comparisons. I'm so proud of this one. What I'm showing you here is a jadeite pendant from the 1st to the 5th century from Costa Rica. And it's interesting to show it with Michael's yellow throated toucan, which he actually painted in Costa Rica, I do believe, right? While this jadeite pendant is identified as a bird on the Met's website, since it comes from Costa Rica, chances are that it's related to a species such as the yellow-throated toucan. And it's one of many species which in pre-Columbian Costa Rica have symbolic dimensions. While this is a pendant, it's made out of jadeite, it has great clarity, and it features the toucan, but with its upright stance and folded hands indicate that the figure is anthropomorphic, implying perhaps that it is another example of a birdman wearing a mask or having been transformed in a shamanic process. According to the complexity of the image, there's also a trophy head at where the feet should be. Let's see if I can do the pointer sort of down in here. And these are frequent motifs in pre-Columbian Costa Rican art. And I think that's a lot of elements to pack into an object that is just under 3 inches in height. Now, of course, I think the most recognizable bird in the world is the dove, which represents the third person of the Godhead of the Holy Trinity in Catholicism and Christianity. Interpretations of the word origins of Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit are as varied as spirit or breath or soul or life-giving principle. For this reason, the Holy Spirit is often seen in depictions of the Annunciation, when Mary's consent to be the Mother of God designates the moment when the Word was made flesh, i.e. Jesus. One of my favorites, I think it's a Roger van der Weyden painting where you have the angel and Mary, and she's saying yes, and there's a stream of light coming in. I couldn't find a picture of it, and it goes right into her ear, not her womb. And it's a little Christ on the crucifix stone. Having grown up Catholic, we were given a term, parthenogenesis, for this whole idea of birth without sex. So my mother told my sister definitely we were not to come home in trouble and try to blame it on parthenogenesis. So why the dove became the symbol of this entity is sometimes traced to the fact that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it was the dove that brought back the sign of land to Noah after the great flood, and the fact that the dove was present at the baptism of Jesus. And as many have pointed out, doves were also considered to be symbols of peace. And this painting by Wilfredo LYME, an artist I've done a lot of work on the right. In Yoruba traditions, both in West Africa and on this side of the Atlantic, the bird's ability to fly makes it a symbol, as we've seen, of communication with the spirit world. As represented in African art, it may come from a specific species or be a composite of several birds and draw on common attributes. Among the Yoruba, the bird's association with the other world is not necessarily all good. If it is a bird of the night, it may be summoned by persons motivated by evil and malice. And the depiction of birds flocking around one bird represents the rulers and healers taking control over these potentially dangerous forces for the good of the community. And here we go again. Birds are also considered to signify the nocturnal powers of women who are witches. So this connects with the birds that we see on the top of Wilfredo LYME. He comes from an Afro-Cuban context, so he's combining elements of Cubism and Surrealism in the 1940s and 50s with concepts of the Yoruba religion. And as we've seen in prehistoric, pre-Columbian Christian context, the bird is this intermediary between worlds as a shared idea. So the presence in LYME's work, specifically on the head, can relate to certain notions of something that's called ashe, which is the power of the head, which is also the seat of the soul. It's sometimes also the symbol of the supreme god in the Yoruba pantheon, Obatala, and is a life force that runs through things, living and inanimate, and is a power, ashe is a power that's achieved through the cultivation of good character and inner peace. So I figured I'd take this a little further with this painting by Wilfredo LYME, which is called When I Am Not Asleep, I Dream. In this work, he's referencing an incident from his childhood when he experienced a bat flickering his wings in his darkened childhood home. He felt that this was a pivotal experience in his work and marked the moment when he became fully conscious of the nature of his own existence. So here the flying entity is here, and it's, just hidden in the various lanes of shadows that define the multiple planes of existence. Now, this sometimes is sort of related to Leonardo da Vinci's story that he tells of a vulture coming down and opening his mouth with his tail and hitting him a couple of times on the lips with his tail. Sigmund Freud later read this as an indication of homosexual tendencies and identified the form of the vulture in the form of the wrap of the Virgin Mother. So you can see here's the vulture's head, comes down, there's the wing, there's the tail, which just happens to make contact with the mouth. Sigmund was way off. And in fact, this form only appears because the conservatives among us know that blues in historical paintings are often made with lapis lazuli, and it's a very fugitive blue, so it keeps changing things. So you have very often in historic paintings these odd apparitions that seem to appear, but it's only because the blue has faded and changed the whole thing. However, it was interesting. Walton Ford is an artist I really like a lot. He's painted a lot of work that talks about ecological issues, vultures eating batteries, by mistake and stuff. But he's really taken it, and he has this form. I don't know if I would call this a vulture. Maybe it's more like a hawk or a falcon. But he does sort of very specifically have the tail come between the legs of the child and into the mouth. So Walton's sort of taken Freud's fantasy and made it much more specific. And I think the baby seems to have grabbed the tail, as babies are wont to do with anything in their reach and chewing on it. Judy's painting of the mute swan in 2008 reminded me of a story I had once read about Siddhartha, who was the future Buddha, caring for a wounded swan. It seems he and his cousin, who was a hunter, were walking in the forest, and a wedge of swans, sort of passed. His cousin aimed at the lead bird and pierced the wing, and the two youths ran over to the swan. And Siddhartha reached it first and started to take care of it and applied herbs to the wound. Predictably, the cousin demanded the swan, and Siddhartha refused to give it to him. Then the events take the character of the story of the two women and the infant in the story of King Solomon in the Old Testament. And both of them had to plead their case before the king and a sort of group of elders. And one of the elders noticed that the most important possession of every creature was life, and the swan would belong to the person who protected it. So then the court awarded the swan to Siddhartha, who then freed it after it had recovered. And Judy, in a journal she keeps, recalls seeing her swan, which she had been watching for 2 years on the Connecticut River, floating one day lifeless in the water. Her late husband, Yale, retrieved it and brought it to her studio, and she created this image that captured its life essence at the same time as the elegance of its being. So I'm picking up on these whole things of owls. This is one of my favorite owl paintings by Michael, called Night Watch, Great Horned Owl from 2002. And I found this owl's face from the Yangshao culture from about 2600 to 23 BC. Anyway, I thought about the relationship of these two. As we've seen in previous examples, while humans see birds as forces for good, visiting us, helping out the virtuous, but birds like owls bring intimations of ill omens. And I put up this quote from Leviticus, which sort of really, is not very favorable to the types of birds we've been looking at. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the falcon, the raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk. I didn't know they had ostriches in Israel. But anyway, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk, the owl. So these are, animals, birds that, in Leviticus have like a pretty bad situation. So it's interesting that while we look at owls as sort of being a symbol of wisdom, there is one Chinese legend that young owls only left the nest after pecking out the eyes of their mothers, and that the large staring eyes were considered demonic, and its call was heard as frightening, and a picture of an owl was used very often in parts of China as a talisman to keep away owls. So ironically, Judy's paintings of owls, we get to appreciate the details of the plumage as we do in Michael's, as well as that of the wingspan. And I, was interested that she chose to show them upside down. I suppose since they were dead and, they're bleeding, it's almost like, you're sort of draining the blood. But I think also it reminded me of the German contemporary painter George Baselitz, who's known for depicting his subjects upside down. So that we might say that Judy similarly encourages the viewer to look past our usual associations with her subject and focus on the visual impact of the form and the character. But then this is the best. This I came across very recently. This is a woven cape and headdress by Margaret Roach Wheeler, who's a Chickasaw Indian, and it's in a show now, which I haven't had a chance to go and see, downtown Manhattan at Bowling Green. In an interview in a recent episode of New York City Arts, Margaret Roach Wheeler noted how her Chickasaw mother feared the presence of the owl as a harbinger of death or danger. So this is coming up again. And the mantle and the mask are part of a series of spirit animals that she's been working on for the last 15 years. So the Chickasaw have been displaced to Oklahoma, but originally they could be found in the Mississippi Valley, Alabama, Tennessee, and Missouri. So this garment can be seen as evoking the Birdman entity who communicated with the upper world. Then I love this kind of comparison of this hanging scroll by Sun Tzu from the Ming Dynasty with Judy's two crows. Again, the Chinese name of the crow comes from its raucous call, which was considered an ill omen. Birds are getting a real bad rap in particularly when it was heard when a deal was being negotiated. So watch out if you hear a crow when negotiating a deal. But it's commended for its social behavior because the Chinese were also able to observe how crows help their parents raise the next generation of birds. And so it's used as an example of filial piety in nature. And in her presentation of these two crows, Judy implies that familial connection. Also, Judy has spent a lot of time in Asia, so that this kind of representation sort of indicates any kind of like residual influence on her work. Showing these two works by Michael DiGiorgio, because I was interested in the different ways that he painted the various birds in landscapes. On the one hand, as you can see with the Andean lapwing and lava flow, they become sort of mementos of an inveterate botanist travel in the tradition of 19th century adventurers. So these paintings allow us not only to enjoy the details of plumage, posture, and habits, but also consider how the birds function in their habitats, either standing out in the process of attracting a mate, or blending in to frustrate predators, whether they're human or not. In some of the compositions in the exhibition, he draws us into the space through the use of perspective and a horizon line, and in others we see the birds set within vegetation as he employs a viewpoint that relates to the marvelous interest in all-over painting and texture as seen in abstract expressionism and minimalist painting. And then I just wanted to sort of show his belted kingfisher with this golden pheasant from China. And his depiction here reminds us that the species of kingfisher in China are admired for their bright, iridescent plumage, and the bird is a metaphor for the more showy forms of female beauty. In the painting of the golden pheasant, this is really, an example of the long tradition of flower and bird painting that is one of the treasures of Chinese culture. This example from the Ming Dynasty demonstrates how representations of nature are not merely imitations. Again, flowers and birds are given symbolic meanings, and different styles of painting were used to convey the artist's own personality and ideas. And then again, contextualizing again, here's Michael's yellow-throated toucan again, with another artist, contemporary artist, who's done a lot of work with birds, Hunt Slocum. Like Michael, Hunt fell in love with birds when he was young, and he now lives in Manhattan in a 30,000 square foot study, which also serves as the home for exotic species such as parrots, macaws, and cockatoos that he collects and cares for. He also breeds peacocks in his property in Louisiana. Hunt is truly a birdman. I thought it'd be interesting to show his toucan within heliconia plants, which are also known as toucan peaks or false birds of paradise. And while the position of the birds is similar to Michael's depiction of the chickadees that we just looked at, Hunt's is informed by a decorative impulse and whimsy, and we can see how he focuses on the patterns created by the accumulation of plants and birds. Now, while I was, like when you're working on a project, every so often something comes up that just sort of like sparks your interest and sort of changes the way that you look at things. I get up every morning and I troll several art websites so I can know everything that's going on. And preparing for this lecture in, I think, about April, there was a posting on Hyperallergic website about this 1899 watercolor of a dead bird that had been found in a settlement left by a lost expedition on the eastern peninsula of Antarctica. Now, this bird is definitely not native to Antarctica. The watercolor was attributed to Dr. Edward Watson, who was a doctor, scientist, and painting from Cheltenham, England. The mystery of how it got there for the 1910-13 expedition, when it was painted several years before, still remains a mystery. But I think that it sort of resonates with Judy's work capturing what critic Sebastian Smee described as, quote, the great and beautiful mystery of death in a state of concentration, sympathy, and respect. And so I compared it to her representations of two woodcocks. Again, we find these sort of interesting correlations. I mean, these are tiles from a marsh scene in Egypt, so they're not really meant to be, you know, sort of seen as separate works of art, but they sort of really follow the protocols of field guide type analysis of the characteristics of birds, seen both in the work of Michael and Judy in this exhibition. In both examples of their work, individual elements of wings, heads, talons, give another experience of birds that helps us in the particulars of their identification. And again, just to sort of, you know, I was really prepared, you know, to sort of do this kind of contrast between Michael's field guide work and Judy's painting. And then Judy, who I've known for 4,322 years, lets on that in 1971, she just happened to illustrate some birds of Korea. So what you'll see in the case in the back room is the book and her own field guide representations, which look just like Michael's. So this is another way that we were able to sort of bring this together. I want to start to conclude this lecture with representations of bird and flight. After all, from the myth of Icarus to the flying fantasies of Leonardo, humans have been fascinated with the flight of birds. As you know, the title of the exhibition was inspired by a line from the poem The Windhover, written in 1918 by the English poet Gerald Manley Hopkins, a celebration of the majesty and aerial acrobatics of the falcon, observed riding on a steady air. Hopkins hints at his jealousy of the bird's mastery of air as he celebrates the brute beauty, pride, and plume of this majestic specimen. So as Judy's bird paintings represent flight tragically interrupted, Michael's inspire us to enjoy the how birds soar within their natural environments. This is another painting that Michael and I discussed putting in the show, but we decided against it, but I still wanted to show to you the coming of spring because you literally can see the movement of the birds moving the air and the landscape around them. And I show this with a print by the Baltimore-based artist Olitha Devane, which is part of a series in which the birds become surrogates for freedom and migration, which has not only marked the history of African Americans at various times in American history, but relates to the fate of millions of world citizens at this moment. I wanted to sort of put in this painting by Betty Blayton Taylor. I knew Betty. She died tragically early in her life last year. And they just had a show of her exhibition, an exhibition of her work at the Elizabeth D. Gallery. Betty was a Buddhist, and she very early on took to the tondo. The reflective surface of the bronze version enhances the sense of movement in space as it is captured as light goes up and down its surface. And then I conclude with this. The biggest bird in the world. TWA Flight Center. This is sort of like another sentimental one with me because my father worked for the Port Authority. He was an architect with the Port Authority, and we used to go out as Idlewild Airport was morphing into John F. Kennedy International, and we would see all the successive buildings. And when this one, Flight Center, came, I mean, I think it was like probably the most exciting thing that we had seen. It was called the Grand Central of the Jet Age by architect Robert Stern. And here, the idea and sensation of flight has been successfully translated into the transient forms of architecture. And this structure reminds us that while we may have approximated that sensation of flight and movement in the planes, gliders, and drones, and even architecture that we create, Judy Cotton and Michael DiGiorgio remind us of the incomparable beauty and wonder of the original flyers. They use their art to recruit us to a commitment to the preservation of birds in an increasingly fragile and endangered environment. And here just are a few